The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was filled with representatives from across the known universe. Hundreds of species had gathered for this emergency session. The lights were dim, and the air was heavy with tension. Everyone knew why they were here. Everyone knew what was at stake, and almost everyone had already made up their minds. At the center of the hall stood a small figure made of living crystal. Her name was Christith, and she was the ambassador of the Velith people. Her body caught the light and scattered it into tiny rainbows across the floor. She was beautiful in a fragile way, like a sculpture made of glass and starlight. But right now, beauty meant nothing. Right now, she was begging for her people's lives. The Velith were dying. Their star was collapsing, and their homeworld would become a frozen wasteland within 2 years. 400 million souls needed a new home. They needed help from the galaxy that they had always believed in. They needed someone to care, but the galaxy had other plans. The Crocian ambassador spoke first. He was a massive creature, covered in thick armored plates. His species controlled 12 star systems and commanded the largest military fleet in the quadrant. Surely, Krista thought, such a powerful empire could spare some small corner of their territory for refugees. The Crocian's voice echoed through the hall like stones grinding together. He expressed sympathy for the Velith situation. He acknowledged that their plight was tragic, but he explained that Crocian territories operated under strict environmental standards. The Velith required specialized conditions that his people simply could not provide. The cost would be too great. The burden would be too heavy. He was sorry. The Crocian Empire must decline. Christith felt the first crack form in her heart. The Min-3 collective spoke next. They were a hive species, millions of minds connected into one vast consciousness. They were known throughout the galaxy for their efficiency, their logic, their perfect calculations. Surely such brilliant minds could find a solution. The Min-3 representative, speaking with the voice of billions, delivered their verdict. They had analyzed the situation from every possible angle. They had run the numbers countless times. The resources required to relocate and sustain the Velith population exceeded any reasonable investment threshold. There was no logical justification for such expenditure. The mathematics simply did not support intervention. The collective expressed regret. But they must prioritize optimal resource allocation. The crack in Christith's heart grew wider, one by one. The great powers of the galaxy gave their answers. The Vessian Confederacy had internal political challenges. The Vrax Dominion saw no strategic value. The Peleron Trade Union found no profitable arrangement. Each rejection was wrapped in polite words and diplomatic language, but the message was always the same. The Velith were too weak, too fragile, too useless. Saving them would cost too much and gain too little. Then the oldest species in the chamber spoke. The Orani had watched civilizations rise and fall for 10,000 years. Their wisdom was legendary. Their judgment was final. When they spoke, the galaxy listened. The Orani elder rose slowly. His ancient body wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of woven light. He looked at Christith with eyes that had seen empires crumble to dust. And then he delivered his verdict. Nature, he said, had its own wisdom. Species that could not survive on their own were meant to fade away. This was not cruelty. This was simply the way of things. The strong endured. The weak perished. The Velith had always been fragile. Perhaps it was simply their time to return to the stars from which they came. The Orani would not interfere with the natural order. The crack in Christith's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The session was ending. Representatives were already leaving, returning to their ships, their minds already on other matters. The Velith crisis was resolved, as far as they were concerned. It would resolve itself, one way or another. In a few years, there would simply be no more Velith to worry about. Christith stood alone in the emptying hall. She did not know how she would tell her people. She did not know how she would explain that the galaxy they had believed in, the civilization they had admired from afar, had simply chosen to let them die. She was not angry. She was too broken for anger. She was simply empty. Then she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see 3 figures walking toward her. They were bipedal, with soft skin and various shades of brown and pink. Their bodies looked sturdy but not armored. Their faces were arranged in expressions she could not quite read. She recognized their species from the Galactic database, though she had never met one in person. Humans, Deathworlders. Every species in the galaxy knew about the Deathworlders. They came from a planet that seemed designed to kill them. Extreme temperatures, violent weather, predators everywhere, diseases that evolve constantly, natural disasters that struck without warning. By all reasonable calculations, humans should have gone extinct millions of years ago. Instead, they had thrived. They had spread across their world and then beyond it. They had joined the galactic community just 50 years ago, and they had already proven themselves to be strange, unpredictable, and slightly terrifying. Krista felt a flicker of fear. What could Deathworlders possibly want with her? The lead human stopped a respectful distance away. He was neither tall nor short, with dark hair streaked with gray and warm brown eyes. He introduced himself as David Chen, ambassador of the United Earth government. His voice was gentle, which surprised her. Ambassador Chen said he had been watching the session from the observation gallery. He and his colleagues had listened to every speech, every rejection, every excuse. They had seen how the galaxy had treated her people, and they wanted her to know something. Kristith waited, bracing herself for another rejection. Ambassador Chen smiled. Something in that smile made Kristith's broken heart skip a beat. He said 7 words that changed everything. "We would like to discuss evacuation options with you." For a long moment, Kristith could not speak. She must have misheard. She must have misunderstood. Perhaps her translator was malfunctioning, because what the human was suggesting was impossible. It was irrational. It made no sense. The Velith had nothing to offer humanity. They had no military strength, no valuable resources, no political influence. They could not survive in human environments. They could not work in human industries. They could not even breathe the same air. Helping the Velith would be enormously expensive and incredibly difficult. There was no logical reason for any species to take on such a burden, and yet here was a human, a Deathworlder, offering to do exactly that. She asked him why. Why would humans help a species that had nothing to give in return? Why would Deathworlders, of all beings, care about the weakest race in the galaxy? Ambassador Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he told her something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. He said that humans understood weakness. They understood vulnerability. They understood what it felt like to face extinction, to struggle against a universe that seemed determined to destroy them. They had survived not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. They had survived because they refused to give up on each other. And now, he said, they refused to give up on the Velith. Kristith looked at the human standing before her. Behind him, the great hall of the Galactic Concord was almost empty. The mighty empires had gone home. The ancient wisdom had spoken. The galaxy had made its choice, but one species had chosen differently. For the first time since, her people learned they were dying. Kristith felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt hope. She told the human ambassador that she was ready to listen. End of Part 1. Every species abandoned. A vulnerable alien race, except the Deathworlder Part 2 Kristith, had never been aboard a human vessel before. She had heard stories about Deathworlder ships. They were said to be harsh and utilitarian, built for creatures who had evolved in a world of constant danger. She expected cold metal walls, harsh lighting, and an atmosphere that would make her crystalline body ache with discomfort. What she found instead made her stop and wonder. The humans had prepared for her arrival. An entire section of their ship had been modified to accommodate Velith biology. The gravity had been reduced to a gentle whisper. The temperature was precisely calibrated to match her homeworld's most comfortable zones. The lighting was soft and warm, designed to pass through her crystalline form without causing stress. Even the air had been adjusted, filled with the exact mixture of gases that her people needed to breathe. Ambassador Chen walked beside her, his steps careful and respectful. He explained that the modifications had taken 3 weeks to complete. Human engineers had studied every available piece of information about Velith physiology. They had consulted with scientists, doctors, and environmental specialists. They had worked around the clock to ensure that she would feel safe aboard their ship. Christith was stunned. 3 weeks. The humans had been preparing for this meeting before the Galactic Concord session had even begun. They had known that the other species would refuse to help. They had anticipated the outcome, and they had already started working on a solution. She asked Ambassador Chen how this was possible. How had the humans known? The ambassador's face showed an expression she was beginning to recognize as sadness. He told her that humans had studied galactic history very carefully since joining the interstellar community. They had learned how powerful species treated weaker ones. They had seen the pattern repeat countless times. When the Velith crisis was first announced, human analysts had predicted with 90% confidence that no major power would offer meaningful assistance, and so the humans had decided to act on their own. They brought her to a large room filled with screens and holographic displays. Dozens of humans were working at various stations, speaking rapidly into communication devices, analyzing data, making plans. A woman with dark skin and silver-streaked hair approached them. Her name was Maria Santos, and she was the director of humanity's emergency response operations. Maria showed Christith the plan that humanity had developed. It was called Project Sanctuary. It was the most ambitious humanitarian effort in human history. The first phase involved evacuating the entire Velith population from their dying world. Human transport ships were already being modified to carry Velith passengers safely. Medical teams were being trained in Velith biology. Supply lines were being established. Within 6 months, humanity could begin moving people. The second phase was even more remarkable. Humans had identified a moon in their controlled territory that could be terraformed to match Velith requirements. It would take decades of work and cost more money than most species spent on entire wars. But when it was finished, the Velith would have a new home. A permanent home. A place where they could rebuild their civilization and thrive for generations to come. Christith stared at the plans. She asked the question that had been burning in her mind since Ambassador Chen first approached her. Why? Why would humans do this? What did they expect to gain? Maria Santos looked at her with eyes that held both warmth and pain. She told Christith something that she would never forget. Humans, Maria explained, understood what it meant to be abandoned. Throughout their history, humans had faced countless moments where survival seemed impossible. Ice ages that nearly froze them out of existence. Plagues that killed half their population. Wars that threatened to destroy everything they had built. And through all of these trials, they had learned one simple truth. The only way to survive was to help each other. The only way forward was together. When humans looked at the Velith, they did not see a weak species unworthy of assistance. They saw people in need. They saw families facing the loss of everything they loved. They saw children who deserved a chance to grow up, to learn, to dream. And humans could not, would not, stand by and watch that future be destroyed. Maria paused, and her voice grew quieter. She told Christith that humans had made many mistakes in their history. They had sometimes failed to live up to their own ideals, but they had also made a promise to themselves. They had promised that whenever they had the power to help someone in need, they would use it. Not because it was easy, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Christith felt tears forming in her crystalline eyes. She had not known that she could cry. Meanwhile, far across the galaxy, other species were watching. The Crocian Intelligence Service had intercepted communications about Project Sanctuary. Their analysts studied the human plans with growing confusion. The numbers did not make sense. The costs were astronomical. The benefits were non-existent. This had to be a deception, a cover for some hidden agenda. No species would sacrifice so much for nothing, the Crocian commander ordered increased surveillance on all human activities. He was certain that the truth would reveal itself eventually. The Minthari collective processed the same information through their vast, networked intelligence. Billions of minds analyzed the data simultaneously. They ran simulations, calculated probabilities, searched for hidden variables. Every model they created predicted that the human plan would fail or that it concealed ulterior motives. The collective concluded that continued observation was warranted. Even the ancient Orani took notice. Their seers consulted records going back thousands of years, searching for precedents. They found none. No species in recorded history had ever sacrificed so much to save another without expecting something in return. The Orani began to wonder if perhaps they had misjudged these Deathworlders. But Christith was no longer thinking about other species. She was standing in a room full of humans who were working day and night to save her people. She was surrounded by beings who had every reason to ignore her, every excuse to look away, and yet had chosen to help instead. She asked Maria Santos one final question. What did the humans want from the Velith in return for all of this? Maria smiled, and it was a smile filled with genuine kindness. She said that humans wanted only one thing. They wanted the Velith to survive. They wanted to see Velith children playing in crystal gardens on a new world. They wanted to know that 400 million people would have a future because humanity had chosen to act. That, Maria said, was payment enough. 2 weeks later, the first human evacuation ships entered orbit around Leth Prime. The dying star cast long shadows across the planet's surface, a constant reminder of the doom that approached. But for the first time in months, the Velith people looked up at the sky and saw hope. The ships were enormous, each one modified to carry 10,000 Velith passengers in complete safety. Human crews had trained for months to work in Velith-compatible conditions. Doctors and nurses stood ready to provide medical care. Engineers had designed special habitation modules that would keep the refugees comfortable during the long journey. Christith stood at the main spaceport, watching as the first groups of evacuees prepared to board. There were families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, scientists carrying precious research data. All of them were taking a leap of faith, trusting their lives to a species they had been taught to fear. A young Velith child approached Christith, her crystalline form shimmering with nervous energy. The child asked if the Deathworlders were really going to help them. She had heard scary stories about humans. She was afraid. Christith knelt down to look into the child's eyes. She told her that sometimes the scariest stories turned out to be wrong. She told her that sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. And she told her that the humans had already proven themselves to be true friends. The child nodded slowly, then walked toward the transport ship, her family close behind. Christith watched as 10,000 of her people rose into the sky, carried away by human ships toward an uncertain but hopeful future. In that moment, she made a silent vow. She would spend the rest of her life making sure the galaxy understood what humanity had done. She would tell this story to everyone who would listen. The Deathworlders had not abandoned the Velith, and Christith would never forget it. End of Part 2, Every Species Abandoned. A vulnerable alien race, except the Deathworlder, Part 3, 6 months had passed since the evacuation began, and the human volunteers were suffering. The conditions required for Velith comfort were slowly destroying human bodies. The low gravity weakened their muscles and bones. The specialized atmosphere irritated their lungs. The lighting that soothed Velith eyes strained human vision. Every day, medical teams treated dozens of workers for exhaustion, respiratory problems, and environmental stress, and yet not a single human had asked to leave. Dr. James Okonkwo had been working at Transit Station 7 for 3 months. He was responsible for the health of both human workers and Velith refugees. His own health had declined significantly. He had lost weight. His hands sometimes trembled. He had trouble sleeping. But every morning, he reported for duty without complaint. A Velith medical observer named Prelith had been assigned to work alongside him. At first, Prelith could not understand why Dr. Okonkwo continued working when his body was clearly failing. Velith culture placed great value on self-preservation. No Velith would sacrifice their own health for strangers. One night, Prelith finally asked the question that had been troubling him. Why did Dr. Okonkwo keep working? Why did he not return to a human station where the environment would allow him to recover? Dr. Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment. Then he told Prelith about his grandmother. His grandmother had grown up during a terrible famine on Earth. Millions of people had died. Food was scarce, and survival seemed impossible. But throughout that terrible time, strangers had helped his grandmother's family. People who had almost nothing had shared what little they had. Neighbors had protected each other. Communities had come together. His grandmother had survived because people, who had no obligation to help her, had chosen to help anyway. And she had spent the rest of her life passing that lesson on to her children and grandchildren. She had taught them that when you see someone in need, you help. You do not ask what you will receive in return. You do not calculate whether it is convenient. You simply help. Dr. Okonkwo smiled tiredly. He told Prelith that his grandmother would haunt him from beyond the grave if he abandoned the Velith. Now, Prelith did not fully understand the concept of ghosts, but he understood the love in Dr. Okonkwo's voice. And for the first time, he began to truly understand humans. Across the transit network, similar scenes were playing out. Human construction workers labored in conditions that made their bodies ache, building housing units for Velith families. Human engineers redesigned life support systems again and again, trying to make the environments more comfortable for their crystalline guests. Human teachers learned Velith language so they could help refugee children continue their education during the long journey. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Then disaster struck. Transport ship carrying 8,000 Velith refugees reported a disease outbreak. A previously unknown pathogen had begun spreading through the passenger compartments. Velith immune systems, already stressed from the evacuation, were struggling to fight it off. Dozens were already sick. If the disease was not contained, thousands could die. Human medical teams responded immediately. 3 doctors and 12 nurses volunteered to enter the quarantine zone. They knew the risks. The disease was poorly understood. The environment inside the quarantine zone was optimized for Velith, which meant it was actively harmful to humans. There was a significant chance they would not survive. They went anyway. Dr. Sarah Kim led the medical team. She was 53 years old, with grown children back on Earth who begged her not to go. She went anyway. Nurse Michael Torres was 27, newly married, with his whole life ahead of him. He went anyway. One by one, 15 humans walked into a death trap to save people they had never met. For 2 weeks, they worked without rest. They developed treatments. They comforted the dying. They held crystalline hands and promised that everything would be okay. The disease was eventually contained, and the lives of 7,800 Velith were saved. But the victory came at a terrible price. 3 humans did not survive. Dr. Kim and 2 nurses gave their lives in that quarantine zone. They could have left at any time. They could have prioritized their own survival. Instead, they stayed until the very end, fighting for people who were not their own species, not their own family, not their own responsibility. When news of their sacrifice spread through the refugee fleet, something changed among the Velith. They had always been grateful for human help, but now they understood something deeper. They understood that humans were not helping them because it was easy or convenient. Humans were helping them because they genuinely cared. They cared enough to die. Christith wept when she heard the news. She had met Dr. Kim briefly during a tour of the medical facilities. The doctor had been kind and warm, with gentle hands and a soft voice. Now she was gone, lost to a disease that was not even a threat to humans, simply because she had refused to abandon her patients. The Velith began to compose songs of mourning for the fallen humans. They added the names of Dr. Kim and the nurses to their most sacred memorial traditions. From that day forward, those 3 humans would be remembered alongside Velith heroes. But the humans did not stop to mourn for long. There was too much work to be done. Far across the galaxy, the Crocian ambassador received another intelligence report. His agents had documented the quarantine incident in detail. They had recorded the human volunteers entering the death zone. They had watched the medical team refuse to leave even as their own bodies began to fail. They had seen humans die for Velith strangers. The ambassador stared at the report for a long time. His entire understanding of the universe was built on a simple principle. The strong dominated the weak. The powerful exploited the vulnerable. Every species acted in its own interest. This was the natural order. This was how things worked. But the humans were not following the natural order. They were breaking every rule that the ambassador had ever known. And he could not figure out why. He ordered his agents to investigate more deeply. There had to be an explanation. There had to be some hidden motive. Because if humans were really doing all of this purely out of compassion, then everything the Croatian Empire believed about the universe was wrong. On Transit Station 7, a human construction worker named Elena Vasquez collapsed from exhaustion. She had been working for 18 hours straight, installing life support systems in a new refugee housing block. Medical staff rushed to help her. They told her she needed to rest. They told her she was pushing too hard. Elena looked up at them with tired eyes. She pointed to a group of Velith children playing nearby. Their crystalline bodies sparkled in the soft lighting. Their laughter sounded like wind chimes. They were alive and happy and safe because humans had built them a place to live. Elena told the medical staff that there were still kids waiting for housing units. She would rest when the work was done. Kristith witnessed this exchange. She was beginning to understand something about humans that no galactic database had ever captured. Humans did not help others because it was easy. They did not help because it made sense. They helped because they could not bear to stand by while others suffered. It was not a choice for them. It was simply who they were. The evacuation continued. Ship after ship rose from Velith Prime, carrying survivors toward their new home. Human workers kept building, kept teaching, kept healing. Some of them got sick. Some of them got hurt. But none of them stopped. And then, just when it seemed like things were finally going smoothly, the universe delivered one more challenge. Sensors detected a massive solar flare building in the dying Velith star. It was larger than anything previously recorded. When it erupted, it would send a wave of deadly radiation across the entire system. Any ship still in orbit would be destroyed. The final evacuation fleet was still loading passengers. 50,000 Velith remained on the planet's surface. There was not enough time to load everyone and escape before the flare hit. Admiral Yuki Tanaka received the report on the bridge of her flagship. She studied the data carefully. Then she began issuing orders. Human ships would form a shield around the evacuation transports. They would absorb the radiation, protecting the Velith vessels. Her officers pointed out that this would likely destroy multiple human ships and kill thousands of human crew members. Admiral Tanaka nodded. She knew. She gave the order anyway. The humans were staying. End of Part 3. Every species abandoned. A vulnerable alien race, except the Deathworlders Part 4. The solar flare erupted with the fury of a dying star. A wall of radiation and plasma exploded outward from the Velith sun, racing toward the planet at incredible speed. It was beautiful in a terrible way. A wave of golden fire that stretched across the entire system. It was also deadly. Any unshielded vessel caught in its path would be destroyed in seconds. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of her flagship, the youth resolute, watching the wave approach on her tactical display. Around her, officers worked frantically at their stations, coordinating the final moments of the evacuation. The last transport ships were still loading passengers. They needed more time. Time they did not have? The Admiral had made her decision. Human warships would form a protective barrier between the radiation wave and the evacuation fleet. Their shields would absorb the deadly energy. Their hulls would take the punishment. Many of them would not survive, but the Velith transports would escape. Her communications officer reported that all ship captains had acknowledged the order. Not a single one had hesitated. Not a single one had questioned the decision. They knew what they were being asked to do. They knew the cost, and they had accepted it without complaint. Admiral Tanaka felt pride and sorrow in equal measure. These were her people. These were her ships, and she was about to send many of them to their deaths. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her voice was calm and steady as she addressed her crews. She told them that what they were about to do would be remembered for generations. She told them that their sacrifice would save 50,000 innocent lives. She told them that she was honored to serve alongside the finest crews in human history. Then she gave the final order. All ships moved into formation. The human fleet spread out in a wide arc, placing themselves directly in the path of the radiation wave. Heavy cruisers took the forward positions, their thick armor designed to withstand tremendous punishment. Destroyers filled the gaps between them. Support vessels moved to the rear, ready to rescue any survivors. Every ship knew its position. Every crew knew its duty. On the planet below, the last evacuees ran toward the transport ships. Velith families carried children in their arms. Elderly citizens helped each other walk. Everyone moved as fast as their fragile bodies would allow. Knowing that the humans above them were buying time with their lives, the radiation wave struck. The human fleet like a hammer made of fire. The first ships to fall were the destroyers on the outer edges of the formation. Their shields flared bright white, then collapsed. Their hulls glowed red, then orange, then white hot. In seconds, they were gone, vaporized by forces no material could withstand. Their crews never felt a thing. It was over too quickly for pain. But the formation held. The larger ships absorbed the punishment, their shields straining against the onslaught. Captains reported damage across all decks. Hull breaches opened in dozens of locations. Fire suppression systems activated throughout the fleet. Crew members died at their stations, killed by radiation that punched through weakened barriers. Still, the formation held. Admiral Tanaka watched as ship after ship went dark on her tactical display. 17 vessels destroyed in the first 30 seconds. Over 4,000 crew members lost. The Resolute itself was taking heavy damage. Alarms screamed across the bridge. Smoke filled the air, but the transports behind them were safe. The Velith were escaping after what felt like an eternity. The radiation wave passed. The dying star's fury had been spent. Behind the shattered remnants of the human fleet, every single Velith transport ship had survived. 50,000 refugees were safely on their way to their new home. The cost had been terrible. 17 human ships destroyed. 4,237 humans dead. Countless more injured. The Resolute herself was barely functional, her engines crippled, her shields gone, her hull scarred by the kiss of stellar fire. But they had one. Admiral Tanaka slumped in her command chair, exhaustion and grief washing over her in waves. She had known the risks. She had accepted the cost. But knowing and accepting did not make the loss any easier to bear. 4,000 souls gone in minutes. 4,000 families that would receive terrible news. 4,000 futures that would never be. And yet, when she thought of the 50,000 Velith who would live because of that sacrifice, she knew she would make the same choice again. Every time, without hesitation, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Every major power had observers in the system. Monitoring the evacuation, they had all witnessed what the humans had done. They had seen human ships deliberately place themselves in harm's way. They had watched human crews die to protect strangers. They had witnessed a sacrifice that defied every principle of rational self-interest. The Crocian ambassador received the report in his private chambers. He read it 3 times, certain there must be some error. There was no error. The humans had really done it. They had really died for a species that had nothing to offer them. For the first time in his long career, the ambassador did not know what to say. The Minthari Collective processed the data through their vast networked intelligence. Billions of minds analyzed the event simultaneously, searching for logical explanations. They found none. The human behavior could not be explained by rational calculations. It could not be modeled by standard theories of species interaction. It was, by every measure the collective used, completely illogical. And yet it had happened. The ancient Oorani seers gathered in their sacred chambers, consulting records that stretched back 10,000 years. They found stories of heroism and sacrifice, of course. Every species had such tales. But they found nothing like this. No species had ever sacrificed so much for another without any expectation of return. No species had ever died in such numbers for beings that were not their own. The eldest seer spoke the words that echoed through the Irani consciousness. Perhaps, he said, they had misjudged these Deathworlders. Perhaps there was something in humans that the galaxy had failed to understand. Perhaps strength was not measured only in military power or economic might. Perhaps true strength lay in the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. It was a revolutionary thought. It challenged everything the Irani had believed for millennia. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Something began to change across the galaxy. The Minthari Collective quietly dispatched engineering teams to the Velith colony world. They claimed it was merely a research mission, an opportunity to study human terraforming techniques. But the engineers brought equipment and supplies far beyond what research would require. They brought tools to build. Individual Crocian citizens began organizing unauthorized donation drives, sending resources to the Velith relief effort against their government's official policy. When authorities tried to stop these drives, the public outcry was so severe that they backed down. Something had shifted in Crocian society. The old certainties were crumbling. Other species followed. The Decian Confederacy offered medical supplies. The Vrax Dominion sent construction materials. Even the Peleron Trade Union, famous for never doing anything without profit, donated transport capacity at no charge. The galaxy was experiencing something it had never felt before. Collective shame. They had abandoned the Velith. They had left 400 million people to die. And then they had watched as the Deathworlders, the species they had looked down upon as primitive and brutal, had shown them what true civilization meant. The contrast was unbearable. The guilt was overwhelming. 1 month after the solar flare, Christith addressed the Galactic Concord for the first time since her people's crisis began. She stood in the same great hall where she had been rejected by every major power. She faced the same representatives who had coldly calculated that her people's lives were not worth saving. But this time, she did not come to beg. She came to bear witness. She told the Concord exactly what had happened. She described the human volunteers who had worked until their bodies broke. She spoke of the doctors who had died in quarantine zones, refusing to abandon their patients. She named the 4,000 crew members who had given their lives so that Velith refugees could escape the solar flare. Then she said something that resonated across known space. You called them Deathworlders. She said, you used that name as an insult. You assumed that because they came from a harsh world, they must be harsh creatures. You believed that their strength came from brutality, their survival from ruthlessness. You were wrong. The struggle of their world did not make them cruel. It taught them that survival means nothing if you survive alone. It taught them that the only true strength is the strength we share with others. It taught them that in a universe of darkness, the only light worth having is the light we create together. The humans did not save my people because they expected something in return. They saved us because they could not bear to watch us die. They saved us because that is simply who they are. Christith paused, letting her words sink into the silent chamber. You asked why Deathworlders would care about the weakest species in the galaxy?
They
She continued, now you know. And now you must ask yourselves a different question. What kind of species do you want to be? End of part 4. Every species abandoned, a vulnerable alien race, except the Deathworlder Spart 55. Years had passed since the last Velith refugee left their dying world. The moon that humanity had promised to terraform was no longer a barren rock. It had been transformed into a paradise of crystal and light. Towering structures of living silicon rose toward the gentle sky. Gardens of crystalline plants stretched across carefully designed landscapes. Rivers of liquid nutrients flowed through channels carved with mathematical precision. The world was called New Harmony, and it was the most beautiful place that Christith had ever seen. Today was a special day. The entire colony had gathered to celebrate the first generation of Velith children born on their new homeworld. Thousands of young crystalline beings ran and played in specially designed parks. their laughter echoing like wind chimes through the morning air. They had never known the fear of extinction. They had never seen their star die. To them, New Harmony was simply home, and scattered among them, playing and laughing alongside, were human children. Christeth watched from a raised platform as a young Velith girl approached a human boy. The two children were roughly the same age, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. The Velith child shimmered with nervous energy, her crystalline form catching the light in patterns that reflected her emotional state. The human boy smiled and offered his hand in friendship. The Velith girl hesitated for just a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Christeth felt tears forming in her eyes. It was such a simple gesture. A child taking another child's hand, but it represented something profound. Two species, once strangers, now joined by bonds of friendship and trust. A future that had seemed impossible 5 years ago, now unfolding before her eyes. Ambassador Chen stood beside her, watching the same scene. He was older now, his hair fully gray, his face lined with age and wisdom. But his eyes still held the same warmth that Christeth remembered from their first meeting in that empty hall of the Galactic Concord. She asked him if he had ever imagined it would turn out like that. The ambassador smiled softly. He admitted that he had hoped, but he had never been certain. In his experience, hope was a fragile thing. It needed to be nurtured, protected, fought for every single day. But when enough people believed in something, when enough hands worked toward the same goal, miracles could happen. He gestured toward the children playing below. That, he said, was the miracle. Not the terraforming technology. Not the evacuation logistics. Not the political negotiations. The miracle was that two species had learned to see each other as family. Christeth nodded slowly. She had spent 5 years studying humans, trying to understand what made them different from every other species in the galaxy. She had read their history, their literature, their philosophy. She had talked to thousands of humans, from engineers to artists to soldiers, and she had finally reached a conclusion. Humans were not stronger than other species. They were not smarter. They were not more advanced. What made them different was something much simpler. They refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. They refused to believe that the universe had to be cold and cruel. They looked at the darkness and decided to light a fire, and they kept that fire burning, no matter the cost. A delegation approached the platform. Representatives from a dozen species had come to attend the celebration. Some of them had been among those who rejected the Velith in their hour of need. They came now with different intentions. The Minthari representative spoke first. The collective wished to formally petition for membership in the Human Velith Alliance. They had studied human methods carefully. They had learned from human philosophy. And they had come to understand that pure logic without compassion was incomplete. They wanted to be part of something greater. The Crocian ambassador stepped forward next. His once proud bearing now carried a hint of humility. The Empire wished to offer formal apologies for their failure to help the Velith during the crisis. They acknowledged that they had been wrong. They had allowed fear and calculation to override their basic decency. They asked for the opportunity to prove that they had changed. One by one, other species made similar declarations. The Ethesian Confederacy, the Vrax Dominion, even the Peleron Trade Union, whose representatives looked distinctly uncomfortable with the concept of giving without receiving. They all wanted to join. They all wanted to be part of the new order that humanity had created. Christeth looked at Ambassador Chen. She asked him if he was surprised by any of this. The ambassador chuckled quietly. He said that humans had a saying, better late than never. The important thing was not that these species had failed in the past. The important thing was that they were trying to do better now. Change was always possible. Redemption was always within reach. All you had to do was take the first step. The formal ceremonies began. Documents were signed. Speeches were made. The Human Velith Alliance officially expanded to include 12 new member species. It was the largest diplomatic shift in galactic history, and it was built on a foundation of compassion rather than conquest. At the center of the ceremony stood a monument that had been erected to honor those who had made this day possible. It was a pillar of crystal and steel, human and Velith materials woven together in an intricate pattern. On its surface were inscribed the names of every human who had died during the evacuation. Dr. Sarah Kim, Admiral Yuki Tanaka, who had succumbed to radiation sickness months after the solar flare. The 4,000 crew members, who had given their lives to shield the refugee fleet. Christith had personally designed the monument. She had insisted that every name be included, that no sacrifice be forgotten. Humans had given their lives for her people. The least she could do was ensure that their memory would endure forever. As the celebration continued around her, Christith noticed a lone figure standing at the base of the monument. It was an Orani elder, ancient beyond measure, his robes shimmering with the light of countless stars. She recognized him as the one who had spoken at the original Concord session, the one who had declared that weak species must accept their extinction. She approached him quietly. She asked if he had come to participate in the celebration. The elder turned to face her. His ancient eyes were filled with an emotion she had never seen in an Orani before. Tears streamed down his weathered face, leaving silver trails that glittered in the light. He told her that he had come to apologize. He had lived for thousands of years, he said. He had watched empires rise and fall. He had seen species triumph and fail. And through all of those centuries, he had believed that he understood the universe. He had believed that strength was the only thing that mattered. He had believed that compassion was weakness. He had been wrong. The humans had shown him something that all his years of wisdom had failed to reveal. True strength was not the power to dominate others. True strength was the courage to help others, even at great cost to yourself. True strength was the refusal to abandon those in need. Even when the universe seemed determined to destroy them, the elder bowed deeply before Christith. He asked for her forgiveness. He asked for the chance to learn from the humans. As the rest of the galaxy was learning, Christith reached out and touched the elder's shoulder gently. She told him that forgiveness was already given. She told him that the past could not be changed, but the future was yet unwritten. She told him that every species had the capacity for greatness, if only they chose to embrace it. The elder nodded slowly, gratitude shining in his ancient eyes. Then he turned to face the monument once more, paying silent tribute to the Deathworlders who had changed everything. As the sun set over New Harmony, casting long shadows across the crystal gardens, Christith walked among her people. She saw Velith families building new lives. She saw human and Velith children playing together without fear. She saw representatives from a dozen species talking and laughing, discovering common ground. She saw hope. Somewhere across the galaxy, other species were still suffering. Other worlds were still crying out for help, but now they would not cry out in vain. The Human-Velith Alliance stood ready, and its promise was simple. No species that asked for help would ever be abandoned again. The Deathworlders had changed the galaxy. Not with weapons. Not with threats. Not with conquest. They had changed it with compassion, and the universe would never be the same. End of Part 5.